The wind on the tarmac was sharp, cutting. In front of us sat the G700, sleek, unmarked, and looking more like a weapon than a transport. My father, Colonel Rhett Robert Jensen, a man utterly obsessed with his own military legacy, was radiating a sickening, condescending pride. He was speaking to General Thorne, the 4-star head of Strategic Command, a grizzled, no-nonsense officer who I knew better than my father could ever imagine. My father gestured at me, a dismissive flick of the wrist. "Don't expect much from her," he said, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. "She's just the liaison. Not exactly operational material, if you know what I mean." General Thorne stopped. He physically stopped. His gaze shifted from my father to me, and held there for a beat too long. It was a look of unreadable, cold precision. He glanced at the billion-dollar aircraft, its engines humming, then his eyes snapped back to me. "Colonel." The general's voice was gravel, cutting through the wind. "This is her command, isn't it?" The world just fell silent. My father's smirk froze, then shattered into a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. It had all started 2 days earlier, and the memory was still burning in my mind. We were at a crowded, high-profile Pentagon mixer, which was my father's natural habitat. He was in his element, a shark cutting through the water, networking and glad-handing. I was in a quiet conversation with a colleague, a senior analyst I actually respected, when my father spotted his target. He marched over, grabbed my arm, and literally dragged me away mid-sentence. "General Thorne, a true honor," my father boomed, his voice dripping with false sincerity as he pulled me forward like a prop. "This is my daughter," he said, and I could already feel the familiar coldness settling in my stomach. "She's got a quiet little admin job over at Langley. Does budget analysis, I think." He chuckled, as if sharing an inside joke. "We're still hoping she finds a real career, you know, but she enjoys the benefits." I was mortified. A hot, quiet shame burned up my neck. This wasn't just any general. This was General Thorne, the man I secretly briefed every single week on the most sensitive black budget projects in the NRO's inventory. This was the man who called me for my analysis. General Thorne just looked at me. His face was a mask of perfect military politeness, but his eyes were pure steel. He knew my clearance. He knew my authority. And he knew what a massive, ignorant professional foul my father had just committed. I just held his gaze, my hand tightening on my glass until my knuckles ached. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Stand down, sir." "It's fine." He accepted the signal, but I saw something in his eyes. A decision being made. He chuckled, thinking it was just another dad joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just belittled me in front of the head of Strategic Command. To understand the reckoning that was now set in motion, you have to understand the 2 lives I was forced to live. Thanksgiving was the worst. It was always the stage for my father's grand pronouncements. He'd stand at the head of the table, wineglass in hand, and deliver his annual toast to legacy. This year, the focus of his adulation was my cousin, who had just landed a minor promotion at a regional bank. My father spoke for 10 solid minutes about his sharp instincts, his drive, his future in finance. I just stared at my plate, the familiar tired coldness settling in my stomach. When he finally sat down, there was a lull. I made the mistake of trying to fill it. "I actually just completed a pretty complex logistics review at work," I offered to no one in particular. My father beamed at me, but it was the wrong kind of smile. It was the one reserved for a child who'd successfully tied their own shoes. He reached over and literally patted me on the head. "That's nice, honey. Really great," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension so thick it suffocated. "Did you file all those TPS reports? Glad to know you're keeping busy." He turned back to my uncle, chuckling. "She's a great little paper pusher, though. Very organized." Paper pusher. That was my call sign in his world. That was the sum total of my identity. I looked across the table at my mother, Carol, a woman who believed peace at any price was still a bargain. She saw the flush of humiliation on my face, the way my jaw tightened, and she just gave me that tiny, pleading shrug. "Don't start." her eyes said. Later, while washing dishes, she'd whisper, "You know how your father is about service, honey, or he just doesn't understand all that complicated computer work. It's easier to just let him have his way. It doesn't cost you anything." But it did. It cost me the energy of having to live two completely separate lives. Because the truth she refused to see, the truth I was forced to hide, was that I wasn't a paper pusher. The truth was, I was Director Vance. The following Monday, I wasn't at a dining room table. I was in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. It's a sterile, soundproof glass box where the air hums with silence and the weight of secrets. My father's loud, boastful world felt a million miles away. My world was here, on a secure VTC with General Thorne and 3 other officials whose faces I wasn't technically supposed to know. I wasn't a liaison. I was the civilian head of Project Airy, a black-budget NRO-CIA joint program. We managed a fleet of high-speed clandestine sensor and transport platforms, the very same ones disguised as unassuming civilian jets. My voice was calm, authoritative, and completely unrecognizable from the quiet daughter at the Thanksgiving table. "General, the asset is go for the Alpha window," I stated, looking directly into the secure camera. "We have a 9-minute low observable pass over the target area. My team will handle the ingress and egress profile. Your team," I added, my gaze locking on Thorne, "is passengers only until they are boots on ground. My call sign, Argus, has final authority on the abort criteria. Is that clear?" There was no discussion. There were no pats on the head. Just a crisp, understood director from the general. At home, my call sign was paper pusher. At work, my call sign was Argus. And Argus was the one General Thorne called, the one he trusted, when he had an impossible problem that needed to be solved with absolute, unquestioned deniability. Argus was the one who managed the black budget assets, set the operational windows, and held the unilateral power to abort a mission that could have global consequences. And after that disastrous, humiliating mixer, I had a chilling realization. The impossible problem that I needed to solve this time was my father. For years I had tried to speak their emotional language and failed. But belittling me in front of General Thorne wasn't just an insult. It was a potential security risk. He didn't respect my boundaries. So I decided I would finally force him to respect my rank. After the humiliation at that mixer, I didn't feel anger. That emotion was a luxury I'd burned out years ago. What I felt was clarity. A cold, quiet, methodical clarity that settled over me like a shroud. The upcoming Stratcom familiarization flight, the G700 walkthrough, that I was personally coordinating for General Thorne, would be the venue. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation. I'd tried that for 20 years, and it was like trying to reason with a brick wall. This would be a correction, a simple, procedural recalibration. I was finally going to speak to him in the only language he had ever respected, protocol and authority. For my entire adult life, my father had been begging me to get him on base. He always wanted to see some real hardware, a transparent attempt to relive his own glory days, and I always suspected to judge my admin job up close. I had always demurred, always made excuses. But now, I would grant his wish. I sat at my secure terminal, not as his daughter, but as Director Vance. I brought up the secure visitor request form for the pre-flight inspection at the Joint Base hangar. It was a simple matter of keystrokes. Guest manifest, addendum, Colonel Rhett Robert Jensen. Host, Director Vance, NRO Airy. I hit submit. My next call was to General Thorne, on a secure line, of course. "General," I started, my voice flat, a small addendum to the manifest for the G700 walkthrough. He immediately cut in, his voice gruff. "Director, before you say anything, I want to apologize for my interaction with your father. His behavior was out of line." I cut him off, just as politely. "No apology necessary, General. That's a family matter." I paused, letting the silence hang. "But I am adding him to the guest list. I believe a calibration is in order." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Then, I heard a sound that might have been a suppressed chuckle. "Understood, Director. We'll proceed on your authority." The invitation that went out was official, embossed with the Department of Defense seal. My father received it, and as I predicted, he was ecstatic. He called me, his voice booming with a pride I hadn't heard since my cousin's promotion. He saw the big words, strategic command. He saw the name, General Thorne. He was so blinded by the flash of 4-star authority, he completely ignored the one line that actually mattered, the line item listing his host, Director Vance. He actually thought I, his little paper pusher, had finally pulled the right string to get him an invitation into his world. The manifest was approved. The protocol was set. My father was so blinded by the 4-star general's name, he never even bothered to read his host's title. He thought he was coming to my workplace to see his world. He had no idea he was about to learn they were the same. We were on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews. The air was cold, sharp, and loud, smelling of jet fuel and power. The jet, my jet, was sitting right there, the unmarked G700. To my father, it probably looked like a rich man's toy, a luxury transport. I knew it as a dormant weapon, a billion-dollar bundle of sensors and encrypted data links that I, and I alone, had the authority to deploy. I was deep in conversation with my lead pilot, going over the pre-flight checks, and his deference was absolute. He and the crew knew who I was. They called me director, and their respect was earned, not demanded. Then, he arrived. My father, Colonel Rhett Robert Jensen, was absolutely beaming with a pride that had nothing to do with me. He was wearing his old blazer, adorned with his service ribbons, as if he were the one being honored. He spotted General Thorne's staff car pulling up and made a beeline, striding right past me. He didn't even glance my way. It was the story of my life. I was the coat rack, the scenery, the invisible, administrative assistant who had somehow gotten him this access. I just stood there, my hands in the pockets of my own plain civilian coat, and I waited. He clapped General Thorne on the shoulder, a breach of protocol so massive it made my teeth ache. But my father felt he was among peers. "General, thank you for this," he boomed, his voice full of backslapping camaraderie. "It's been too long since I've seen some real hardware up close." He then gestured to me, an afterthought, as I stood beside the 4-star officer he was trying to impress. "My daughter here," he started, and I felt the familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach. "She's just the liaison. Don't expect much from her," he said, and there it was, that familiar belittling smirk. "She's not exactly operational material." The air didn't just go cold. It froze. The flight crew, who had been bustling around the aircraft, went perfectly still. The wind seemed to stop. General Thorne didn't smile. He didn't move. He just looked at my father with a flat, hard expression. Then he turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, to look at me. "Colonel," his voice was low and cut through the tarmac noise like a blade. "I think you misunderstand the command structure here." My father's smirk faltered, confusion clouding his face. General Thorne gestured with an open palm, first at the massive state-of-the-art jet, and then, very deliberately, at me. "This is her command, isn't it?" My father's face went blank. Her what? I took one step forward. My voice, when it came out, was not the voice of his daughter. It was the cold, clear, emotionless voice of Argus. The voice that briefed generals, that managed billion-dollar assets, that made life-or-death decisions in sterile, windowless rooms. "Dad," I said, and his eyes snapped to me, "you are a guest on my asset." Under the authority of Project Airy, as if I had flipped a switch, the lead pilot, the one I had been speaking with, walked past. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at the general. He looked at me, snapped a salute so sharp it could have cut glass, and said, "Director Vance, Argus's is green lit. Wheels up on your command." The blood drained from my father's face. I watched him process the words, the name, the titles. "Director Vance, Argus, her command?" He looked from the saluting pilot to the 4-star general who was standing there deferring to me, and finally back to his daughter. The decades of arrogance, the smug superiority, the confident condescension, it all evaporated in a single, silent instant. It was replaced by a pure, unadulterated, speechless shock. His military bearing, drilled into him for 30 years, took over his body. He didn't know what else to do, so his training reacted for him. He involuntarily snapped to a rigid, ramrod-straight posture of parade rest. His eyes were wide, finally seeing the 5-star authority he had just belittled. My father had spent my entire life teaching me the importance of rank. In the end, it only took 6 words on a tarmac for him to finally learn who outranked who. My father didn't say a word for the entire 20-minute tour. He was a ghost. He was a shade in his own uniform, standing in the shadow of hardware he couldn't comprehend, and a power structure he just learned he was at the bottom of. He just followed. He walked 2 steps behind me and General Thorne, his hands clasped behind his back. In that rigid parade rest he'd snapped to, as if he were afraid to break it. He was a relic, and in the presence of modern, silent power, he had been rendered utterly irrelevant. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't offer a single piece of old-school wisdom. He just watched, his eyes wide, as I did my job. General Thorne and I continued our pre-flight check, our conversation a stream of jargon that was a second language to me, and complete alien code to my father. The new sensor packages on the winglets are outperforming projections. General, I said, pointing to a nearly invisible seam on the jet's skin. The data link encryption? He asked, his voice a low growl. Sub-millisecond latency, I replied. The new threat vectors from your last brief are already mitigated. My team uploaded the patch last night. My father's face was blank. He was a man who understood cannons and formations, and I was speaking in terms of terabytes and algorithmic warfare. He had no idea what we were talking about, and for the first time in his life, he knew better than to interrupt. The tour ended. We were back at the base of the jet stairs. General Thorne nodded to me, a simple, respectful inclination of his head. Director, shall we? I nodded. General? As I put my foot on the first step, a young, crisp aide, someone I didn't even recognize, probably from the general's staff, stepped up to my father. The dismissal was so polite it was brutal. Colonel Jensen, thank you for your time, sir, the aide said, his voice perfectly neutral. I can escort you back to the visitor's gate. He wasn't invited on the flight. He was being handled. He was being dismissed. I didn't look back as I ascended the stairs. I didn't need to. I could feel his eyes on my back, burning with a confusion and a humiliation I'd never seen in him. I could picture him, and I knew the image would be seared into my mind forever, a retired colonel. A man of blustering pride, standing small and alone behind a distant chain-link fence, a barrier between his past and my present. He was watching me, his paper-pusher daughter, board a billion-dollar classified asset alongside a 4-star general. The heavy, pressurized thud of the G700's door sealing him out was the only sound I needed. That was the real end. 6 months later, I was in a room where the air itself felt heavy. The White House Situation Room. It wasn't my first time here, but it was my first time at the head of the table. For years, I had been the invisible child in my own home, and for the first part of my career, I was one of the anonymous analysts sitting in the chairs against the wall, the paper pushers who only spoke when spoken to. But today, I wasn't on the wall. I was at the table, my briefing binder open, the National Security Advisor to my left. My voice, when I spoke, was the only sound in the room. My projections on the cyber ISR integration are firm, I stated, my voice calm, steady, authoritative. The AIRI platform can provide persistent, low observable coverage of all 3 target areas, but only if we maintain the data link integrity. I looked at the faces around the table, generals, directors, cabinet secretaries. No one was patting me on the head. No one was calling me liaison. The respect in that room was absolute, not given out of obligation, but earned through sheer undeniable competence. This was my true family. Not one of blood and dysfunction, but one of mutual capability, where Your rank was determined by what you knew and what you could do. That evening, I was back in my secure office. The sterile quiet a welcome relief. The small red light on my desk phone was blinking. A non-secure voicemail, forwarded from an old, unlisted administrative line, had somehow made it through the filters. I picked up the receiver, my brow furrowed, and pressed play. And then I heard his voice. But it was a voice I'd never heard before. It was small. It was hesitant. It was... "Old Director Vance," he began. The title, in his mouth, was so jarring it took my breath away. He was silent for a long, heavy 5 seconds. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. "My name..." He cleared his throat. I saw a report, on the news." His voice was thin, reedy. "It mentioned a successful operation. A hostage rescue, I think. They didn't use your name, of course, but I knew." He took a shaky breath. The way they described the support, the speed, the unprecedented surveillance, I knew it was you. It was impressive. Very impressive. Another long, agonizing pause. "Call me. Please." I sat there, in the silence, listening to the dial tone. I played the message again, just to be sure. The man who had spent 30 years belittling me, the man who had defined his entire life by his own perceived authority, was asking for my approval. I felt nothing. Not the hot, white-hot rage I would have felt a year ago. Not even the cold, quiet satisfaction I had felt on that tarmac. Just finality. It was like a ledger that had finally been zeroed out. His validation, the thing I had subconsciously craved for my entire childhood, the thing I had fought to earn, it had finally arrived, and it was irrelevant. My peace was no longer a negotiation. It wasn't dependent on his apology. It wasn't dependent on his acknowledgement. It was simply mine. My finger hovered over the keypad. I didn't hit call back. I hit delete. The little red light on the phone stopped blinking. I archived the message in the system log, tagged "No reply necessary," and turned back to the classified document on my main screen. A new operation, a new set of threat vectors, a legacy that was still waiting to be built. My father believed a legacy was something you inherit. I learned a true legacy is something you build in silence, and have acknowledged on a flight line. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your authority is always recognized.